welcome as we now enter into a season of the year, which perhaps for lack of a better term is called ordinary time. And this would be the 11th Sunday of the year. And as I mentioned earlier, this year, the primary gospel guide is Mark. And so for the next few weeks, until really the end of July, the gospel will always be from the tradition of Mark. Mark, as we pointed out earlier on, was the first of the gospel writers, canonical gospel writers, we believe, writing somewhere around the 70s, maybe a little before, perhaps a little afterwards. They dispute exactly the right time. And being the first of the Gospels in what is known as the synoptic tradition, the other two would be Luke and Matthew, Mark sets the story or the pattern which is followed by them. Now I review all of this because we're going to pick up with the Gospel of Mark. We heard it earlier on, that would be the time before the Lent Easter time. And this time we're going to come to chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel, which is known for his parables. Now, Mark does not have a number of parables, despite the fact that he considers Jesus to be a teacher. And it's here in chapter 4 that he includes 4 parables, all of which are also picked up and developed by, as I've mentioned, Matthew and Luke. So that's a little bit of the background. And we will examine briefly chapter 4 because in other years, earlier parts of this gospel are picked up by Matthew, as I mentioned, and Luke. But today we will look at verses 26 through 34 of chapter 4. The other readings, back up a moment, from Ezekiel, the Old Testament prophet, chapter 17, verses 22 through 24, and the middle reading from 2 Corinthians, the letter of Paul, chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. We won't be speaking too much here of 2 Corinthians, but we will be getting sections of 2 Corinthians also for the next few weeks. So the only one that changes, as you remember, is the first reading, which is chosen because in some ways it reflects on the portion of the gospel that we are looking at. So what is chapter 4 of Mark's gospel all about? About parables. We have in the past pointed out that parables were typical teaching devices of many, not simply gospel writers, but also many in the ancient world. A parable, as we have pointed out and that you will remember, is generally a good story taken from a known everyday experiences. Doesn't necessarily mean that a person would be a farmer in the first century world, but they certainly would know how farming took place, or would know how household activities took place. So a good story starts with what we would call the known. So this would be something that people either knew from experience or had heard regularly from the worlds that they lived in. It's generally a parable, a colorful story, sometimes taken to exaggeration. This is not always the case with Mark, but it is certainly characteristic of parables. And the exaggeration being made in the parable is to, of course, get people's attention. It's like any story we tell. If we exaggerate a little bit, people will blink their eye maybe twice rather than once and pay attention to the story. Then there is always something unusual in the parable, something that's out of place. We kind of know how this should go, and suddenly there's an addition or subtraction that makes it different. And the conclusion of good parables is that generally they are not so much giving an answer, but raising a question, something that one might kind of think about or reflect on. Now again, those are the general characteristics of parables. Mark follows it somewhat, although he tends to deviate a little bit more than the other two synoptic writers do. The first part of chapter 4 is a major parable, one that we won't spend a lot of time on because you've heard it before, and it won't be the one that will be this coming weekend. It begins, chapter 4, by picturing Jesus as gathering at the seashore, that would be the Sea of Galilee, getting in a boat and moving slightly away from the shore. We've mentioned this before. That would be a technique of a good teacher because water tended to carry sound much better than land did. So the people would gather on the shore, Jesus would sit in the boat and proceed to teach. So that's the opening two verses of chapter 4, the setting for Jesus' teaching. This is followed by a parable that is well known, the parable of the sower who went out to sow seed. Seed falls on 4 different grounds, and there are 4 different reactions that the seed receives. After that parable, which many believe is pretty close to an original that Jesus himself may well have taught, and this is pretty much true about Mark, that these may well be parables that Jesus himself used. At the end of that parable is a little section in which the disciples meet with Jesus and want to know, why does Jesus teach in parables? Now, this will not be in the reading this week, but turns out to be one of the most difficult sections in all of the gospel tradition. This, where Jesus privately talks to the 12 and maybe a couple of others who were around him, and they ask him why he teaches in parable, and the response is rather obscure and debated. As I say, it's one of the most debated points in the New Testament, because what it says is revelation is given to insiders, but outsiders are not to understand or get the message, which is somewhat contradictory to the whole purpose and point of the Gospels, and that's where the discussion takes place. Now, the one assumption is that Jesus can say this to his disciples because they understand how it works. And, if it's something that everyone is familiar with, why do you need to explain it and go into detail? Well, that's one explanation here. Some say that this section represents a dispute that Mark's community had with the Jews, and especially remember that this is an early gospel, that there is these are the emergent decades of the early Christian church, and there is still really a tension between Judaism, or those rather who were members of the Jewish community, and now an enveloping larger segment of people who were not raised in Judaism. Well, that's, as I just mentioned, is a very mysterious section in this chapter. This is followed by what we would now call an allegory. In other words, the gospel writer Mark, having taken the original parable that we mentioned a moment ago, now gives it allegorical meanings. And that, of course, is another kind of insight into the Markan tradition. Allegory means that there are hidden meanings or meanings underneath. So just to refresh our memory, remember that the sower sows seed. The allegory says the sower sowed the word. See, so how do you sow a word? Well, and that goes on to explain some tensions within the Markan community. Now we come to the readings that are for this time, verses 26, which are 2 further parables. One is the sower goes out to sow the seed and then does nothing. He simply goes home whatever he did, and the seed begins to grow, and it begins to kind of get sprouts and begins to get bigger, and finally comes to the point where it is full grown, and then the only task of the farmer is to take the sickle and go and cut down the harvest. So this is the first of the two parables that we're going to listen. It's interesting because the seed sower really does nothing. I mean, he doesn't fertilize, he doesn't water, he doesn't kind of weed the crop a little, kind of things that we would ordinarily do even in our own day in order to enable the growth of the seed to take place. Perhaps the reason why nothing is to be done is that in all God's good time, the harvest comes to be. The emphasis on this little story seems to be that it is God's work, and that the growth of the community of believers may be slow, may be not happening as fast as one would like. Think about it. The seed doesn't grow any faster than what nature itself is going to allow it to do. And some say that the purpose here of this particular parable included in Mark's story is to support his own growing community of the fact that the work that they are doing, the sowing of the seed, that is, the word and the ways of Jesus into the world, are taking root, but that it's going to take a while for the result of that to be seen. That is one interpretation that is given to this section of Mark's story. The second parable is that a sower goes out to sow mustard seed. And now there's a lot of stories here about mustard seed. He begins by saying that it is the smallest of all seeds. Well, that's not really true. There are smaller seeds than a mustard seed. An orchid seed, a cypress seed are much smaller, and they do not grow into giant trees. Now, that's the way in which the mustard seed story is, that eventually this grows into, now when we say a giant tree, please do not think of the trees outside or the ones that we are familiar with here in our country, but a mustard seed is true. We have some evidence about the height of these. They grow to the height of 2 to 6 feet. So now if you think 6 feet is a giant tree, all right. But what is characteristic of it is that the birds of the air come and nest and find shelter under it. So in that sense, certainly the gospel story is, it is a tree. Now what is important, and today perhaps we're going to reflect a little bit about our arbor techniques, that is our tree abilities. Trees do play a special part in the scriptural tradition. And that's where the reading from Ezekiel really in many ways fits this week into the gospel narrative. Ezekiel 17. Now, what do we remember about the prophet Ezekiel? Ezekiel was a prophet who went into the period known as the exile with the fellow Hebrews of the south. That would be the territory of Judea. Ezekiel, who is rather a very colorful prophet in the Old Testament, he has all kinds of visions, and he's generally always hollering at his fellow Hebrews, kind of saying the reason why they're in exile was something that they had done, and that indeed they are being punished for that. So here is a prophet, however, who is with his fellow Israelites in the place of exile, which would be Babylon. And the Babylonians had taken Judea in the year 576. And much of what happens to the Israelites would be considered to be, and here, as I mentioned, the prophet seems to support this, something that was well deserved. Now, what Ezekiel says here is that there will come a time in which the exile will be over, and there will be a good time, and that God, and here is what the reading that we hear, that God will take a sprig. Now a sprig grows on the top of a tree. I'm not a great tree expert here, but this is what they tell us. And you take the top of the tree and plant that in the ground, and it becomes the source of a new tree. And so the prophet pictures that God will take a sprig and go to the holy hill. The holy hill, of course, is Mount Zion, which is where the city of Jerusalem is, and will plant seeds, or not seeds there, but sprigs. So the mustard seed. Now here is the idea, and what you will also hear as we listen to the little section from Ezekiel, is that what will happen is that the conquerors who have played loose and free and easy with the Israelites will now be put down. The concern that the prophet has is that Israel's punishment was that it had not relied on the Lord, but it had chosen to make an alliance with Egypt, and that had been the cause of its downfall. So here, as I said, God appears as a planter, as an arborist. He puts the top of a mighty cedar. Now, it's not a mustard seed, but it's a cedar tree. And you will remember that in the ancient world, cedars were very, very important trees. They do not grow very much in the Holy Land. Lebanon was the place, of course, where great cedar trees were grown. And in another part of the Israelite story, you remember earlier on that Solomon, when he had built the great temple, had gotten cedar wood from Lebanon, and it had been brought down, and that, of course, had been what had been the source for the great temple that Solomon had built. And at the time that Ezekiel is writing, that temple had been destroyed. So the point that the prophet says is God is creating a new beginning for Israel. One of the characteristics that is unique to the Markan story is this idea of new, that what is happening with the coming of Jesus and the messiahship of Jesus is not that he's opposed to the thought that it's something that's continuing from what had been, but that Jesus is inaugurating and bringing something new into the human story. We will have reason to look at this again. So what is taking place here is that the kingdom of God, namely in choosing Israel to be his people, will, with Jesus coming, manifest a new kind of empire. Now, and the reason I kind of moved this around a little bit is keep in mind that what the prophet Ezekiel had in mind is that God would restore the dignity and the power of Israel, but it would be in terms of how Davidic thinking had gone, that it would be a powerful kingdom and that there would be certainly glory and praise given to God through Israel, but Israel would be kind of top dog on all of this. This is where the kingdom that Jesus is pictured as bringing is, as we know, very different. So, planting a mustard seed. Now, I started by saying it's considered to be a small tree. Some would say, would you really want to plant mustard seeds? Because mustard seeds have the ability, once they are planted, to spread. I probably have used this image before that you remember. It would be, planting a mustard seed would be like planting a dandelion seed. Now, those of you who are great dandelion or buttercup lovers will say, well, yeah, I like them, I would plant them. But what happens is they tend to have the ability to spread. Once they're there, those of you who have grass always are trying to get is therefore the mustard seed a weed? And there is kind of the thought, a weed is something that doesn't belong. Well, if you plant a whole bunch of mustard seeds, are you planting weeds, or are you planting something that you hope will be a kind of a harvest? So that's kind of the point here, that some smile and say, who would do this? Well, mustard seeds have the ability to spread. Is that what maybe Mark has in mind? That by planting a little seed like the mustard, it will have the ability gradually to spread out, and much like the gospel belief that Mark's community has, that's what will happen. It will grow and become more and more, gradually. So there is a connection between that first parable and this parable, that things take time, that as much as we would like to hurry them along, and one can see that there were many who thought that it would be great if we could not see this message of Jesus take hold much quicker, would be not the case. But what will be is that the mustard seed will grow to such a way that it becomes a giant tree or bush in which the birds of the air can come and settle. And that makes it important, and that makes it important. Remember, and again, there's a link between Ezekiel and Jesus' the message here in Mark, that Israel, when it was in exile, was an immigrant community. It dreamed of the day when it could return to its homeland. But as they lived in Babylon, they were indeed immigrants, and perhaps there was a message being sent in the first century world, just as there might be in the world of our time. What rights and privileges do immigrants have? Do not immigrants live with a true spirit of hope, a hope that the situation under which or in which they are living might become better, that life itself might become safer and richer, and thus the tree where the birds can come can find safety and support. Now, as much as some would say, would you plant a weed? I did come across this, that Pliny, who was a Roman historian, you remember, of the first century, had something to say about mustard seeds. And he said this, that mustard seeds and what grows from it are extremely beneficial for health, he said. And here is a list of the things that he said the mustard seed could provide: for snake and scorpion bites, toothaches, indigestion, epilepsy, asthma, constipation, dropsy, tetanus, leprous sores, and other illnesses. Well, if that were true, that this one seed could do all of those kind of things, one might understand why a farmer might be tempted to plant mustard seed, because he or she, most cases he, saw an advantage to harvesting this kind of, is it a weed or a flower or a seed? So There's a lot going on here, I think, that with this little bit of information that Mark gives us. So what could we kind of summarize a little bit here? Well, in the manifestation of God's empire or reign or kingdom, which would not be the same, as I mentioned, it had been the dream of a Davidic kind, but the kind that Jesus was doing, that the actions and impact of Jesus' ministry may seem small and ineffective or even invisible in the present compared to the future. But that is what would be important in planting the seed. Jesus' action among the vulnerable, the sick, demonic, possessed, and receptive are life-changing. There would be a continuity. There's a continuity that connects seed and shrub, the beginning and the end. It starts as a seed, it develops into a shrub. It starts as something very small and almost insignificant to something that becomes life-sustaining and supportive. There's a certainty here, an inevitability that the mustard seed will become a large shrub, regardless of its initial smallness. Now, that may be true of a lot of seeds, but there's one thing that we know about the mustard seed is it tended to be rather hardy. It would be very hard for it not to be productive of what was the end goal. And again, certainty here of growth. It's God's activity that is behind God's empire. We don't always use the word empire when we refer to God. One particular writer likes to use that, who has done a very remarkable new commentary on Mark's gospel. We tend to think of kingdom and, kingdom. Well, empire would be, of course, what Rome really was, the Empire of Rome. So all of those are kind of just some thoughts as we look at the little section here from Mark. And it concludes, again, we won't have much discussion on this this week, but the continuity, the rootedness, and the purpose of God's kingdom can nicely be found, and perhaps here, returning now to the image of a tree. When we think of trees, they start very small, but they grow and grow and grow stronger. They don't last forever, but they do last a long time, and they do therefore order and offer support to many others. The importance, of course, of a seed is that it produces life, and life is the gift of God. So those are some thoughts on chapter 4. You might want to read the whole, as I mentioned, the first part of Mark's parable system here. And by the way, these remain part of the synoptic tradition. We don't get too many more parables of Mark at all. This is just where they are. So he pictures Jesus as a teacher. This is the only place where really we find out what Jesus is teaching, what his teachings would be. We assume, because of the other Gospels, that we know what it is, but if we had only Mark, it might not be quite as clear. So in this little section, going back, he speaks about the fact that you don't put a lamp under a bushel basket, you don't hide your whisper something, you speak it aloud. So all of this is encouraging the community of Mark that it has a wonderful and an important task of planting the seeds of love, of hope, and of trust. We might not see, says the gospel writer Mark to his community, the results immediately, but it is with God's growth that is happening and support that what we start will develop into something very important, very life-giving, life-supporting, life-enabling. The parable of the seed, the mustard seed, in some ways, says Mark, reflects the Christian story. Thank you for being with us, and have a good week.